Los Angeles is the densest urbanized area in the United States. Over 7,000 people packed into every square mile. That number beats New York City, which manages 5,239 people per square mile. But when you look at Los Angeles from the air, those numbers make no sense. The city looks like it goes on forever. Palm trees, parking lots, and strip malls stretching toward the mountains. New York has skyscrapers that pierce the sky. LA just spreads. For 54 years, building anything taller than 13 stories in Los Angeles was illegal. When that ban finally ended, developers should have rushed to build towers. The population was exploding, land prices were climbing, every economic signal pointed in that direction, but almost nothing changed. The flat skyline stayed flat. It's been over 60 years since the ban ended, and downtown LA still has fewer tall buildings than cities half its size. Several long-standing limits defined how tall the city could build, and each barrier made building up a little harder. Stack them all together, and you get a city that chose sprawl, then spent a century making sure nothing could challenge that choice. So how does the densest city in America look like the least dense? And why did Los Angeles fight so hard to keep it that way? When Los Angeles started booming after World War II, the population exploded. 1.5 million people in 1940 became 4.5 million by 1970. 3 million new people arrived in just 3 decades. But instead of clustering into a tight downtown like Boston or Philadelphia, LA did the opposite. It scattered. The automobile made this possible in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined. Someone could own a house in the valley, commute to an aerospace plant miles away, and still get home for dinner. Freeways let people live 20, 30, even 40 miles from their workplace. Distance stopped being an obstacle, so LA became dense in a completely different way. Instead of building up, it built out. Single-family homes on tight lots. 2-story apartments, bungalow courts, low-rise buildings repeated block after block across hundreds of square miles. Multiply that across an enormous area, and suddenly you have over 7,000 people per square mile without a single high-rise in sight. The key was consistency, no empty countryside between neighborhoods, no sprawling estates breaking up development, just continuous construction from the mountains to the ocean. People moving to LA got backyards and garages, things impossible to afford in Manhattan. The trade-off was accepting that everything would require a car to reach. But LA didn't just choose cars over towers. City leaders made building tall illegal, and for 54 years, anything taller than 13 stories was banned. This was a deliberate plan to force the city to grow exactly this way. And that law created something unlike any other city in America. In 1904, Los Angeles passed an ordinance prohibiting buildings taller than 13 stories, or 150 feet. That restriction stayed in place until 1958. Over half a century, city leaders had specific reasons for the ban. They wanted Los Angeles to remain a health and resort destination, famous for fresh air and sunshine. Tall buildings would cast shadows across streets and create the dark urban corners that defined eastern cities. People who moved to California moved specifically to escape those conditions. So why would LA recreate what migrants were fleeing? The economic logic was just as deliberate. Property owners on the edges of town strongly supported the height limit because it forced development to spread outward instead of concentrating downtown. If you couldn't build a tall office tower in the center, you had to buy more land further out. This redistributed real estate wealth away from downtown landowners and toward people who owned property in expanding neighborhoods. The height limit ensured a large number of property owners could benefit from growth rather than concentrating value in a small central district. The restriction worked exactly as intended. Neighborhoods like Hollywood, Westwood, and Wilshire developed their own commercial centers, instead of clustering everything downtown. But the law had one glaring exception. When City Hall was completed in 1928, it rose to 454 feet, 3 times taller than the legal limit. City leaders had simply exempted themselves from the rule they imposed on everyone else. For 4 decades, City Hall stood alone because it was the only building legally permitted to be tall. Voters finally repealed the ordinance in 1956. The city replaced the outright ban with new rules based on floor area ratio, which theoretically allowed taller construction. Developers could finally build towers if they wanted, but decades of horizontal growth had already set the pattern. Even without the law, LA had committed to sprawl. And new restrictions would prove even more effective at preventing density than the original ban. When the height limit ended, it should have triggered a construction boom. Instead, modern zoning replaced the old law with something more powerful. Here's the scale of what happened. 77.7% of residential land in the greater Los Angeles region is exclusively reserved for single-family housing. If you own land in more than 3/4 of the metro area and want to build anything other than a single-family home, zoning prohibits it. Duplexes, apartments, and condos are illegal. Neighborhoods across the region adopted restrictions that prevent the kind of density that would support a vertical city. Only 11.8% of all land is zoned for multifamily housing. Even in those limited areas, additional rules make construction difficult. Height caps, set at below 100 feet, cover vast stretches of the city, ensuring that even where apartments are technically legal, they can't rise more than a few stories. Some neighborhoods took this even further, with rules so specific they seem almost designed to stop development entirely. The Wilshire Westwood Scenic Corridor has a regulation that no structure higher than 6 stories can cast a shadow on a residential building for more than 2 hours during midsummer and midwinter. That single rule blocks tall buildings across miles of prime real estate along one of the city's most important corridors. These restrictions also served a purpose beyond controlling height. Wealthier neighborhoods used zoning to maintain low population levels, preserve property values, and keep out development that would bring more residents. The result was a city where sprawl was the only legal option in most places. The original 1904 height ban forced LA to spread horizontally. Modern zoning ensured it stayed that way. Even in downtown, where towers were technically permitted and economically viable, one more obstacle appeared, and this one had nothing to do with property rights or neighborhood politics. Starting in 1974, the Los Angeles Fire Department created Requirement Number 10, a mandate that would quietly define the city's architectural character for 4 decades. The rule required nearly all high-rise buildings, generally those over 75 feet, to include a flat rooftop emergency helicopter landing facility. Los Angeles was the only major American city with this specific requirement for tall buildings. The policy had immediate visual consequences. It resulted in a flat, drab, and stunted skyline. Every major tower built during this period had to sacrifice architectural distinction for a functional helipad. 3-dimensional tops like those defining New York, San Francisco, and Chicago were prohibited. The rooftop had to be flat and clear for helicopter landings. The fire department justified the mandate by pointing to its Air Operations Division. Helicopters could conduct aerial rescues during high-rise fires, landing on rooftops to evacuate trapped occupants. In theory, this added a safety layer for buildings where stairwell evacuation might be too slow or dangerous during emergencies. But the rule created a tension between safety policy and urban design. Critics argued that emergency evacuation elevator systems offered superior alternatives. These systems could cut evacuation times in half and provided daily utility for elderly and disabled residents who struggled with stairs even during non-emergency situations. Helipads, by contrast, sat unused for years at a time, while forcing every tower to adopt the same flat-topped silhouette. The policy remained in force until September 2014, when the city finally revised the code. 4 decades of architectural potential sacrificed for emergency equipment rarely used. New buildings between 420 and 1,000 feet became exempt from the helipad requirement if they incorporated enhanced fire safety measures. This timing mattered. The Wilshire Grand Center became the first downtown skyscraper to benefit from the change, featuring a distinctive spire and curved crown. At 1,100 feet, it immediately became the city's tallest building and offered a glimpse of what the skyline might have looked like if the helipad rule had never existed. Removing the mandate also opened new possibilities for architectural expression, but it didn't suddenly make skyscrapers economically attractive across the city. Two fundamental constraints remained, and unlike the helipad rule, these couldn't be fixed by revising city policy. Los Angeles sits in a high seismic zone. This transforms every tall building from an engineering challenge into an economic calculation that very often doesn't add up. Per regulations, engineers have to design towers to survive massive earthquakes, regular ones, and also worst-case scenarios. Earthquakes that might only happen once every few thousand years. The building has to be able to handle enormous sideways forces, roughly 10 entire floors worth of weight pushing from either side instead of pushing down. That means thicker columns, reinforced foundations, and specialized damping systems. But here's what makes this even more expensive. Buildings that follow all the safety codes have one primary goal: stay standing long enough for people to get out. The building might survive the earthquake, but be too damaged to ever use again. For building owners, this creates an uncomfortable scenario where their asset survives structurally but becomes economically worthless. The 52-story gas company tower illustrates the financial burden. The building uses a steel frame structure that suffered damage during the 1994 Northridge earthquake. Retrofitting the tower was initially estimated at $230 million, exceeding the building's $200 million purchase price. That's a situation where fixing the building costs more than the building itself is worth. When seismic engineering expenses approach or exceed property values, the economic case for constructing skyscrapers weakens considerably. Developers can build horizontally across cheaper land without these extraordinary structural costs. For many projects, that math determines everything. But even if a developer accepts the seismic burden, federal aviation regulations impose absolute height limits across much of the city. The Federal Aviation Administration enforces mandatory restrictions on structures near Los Angeles International Airport and other airfields to ensure safe flight operations. These permanent constraints prevent vertical growth in desirable West Side areas like the Wilshire Corridor, blocking the formation of multiple competing skylines outside downtown. The LAX Northside sub-area covers 340 acres, approximately 15 miles southwest of downtown. This zone functions as a legally designated airport buffer. Development here must follow strict low-rise design strategies. Residential dwelling units of any kind are prohibited entirely. Height limits range from 30 feet in the Airport Support District to 60 feet in the Center District. Flight paths create invisible ceilings across vast stretches of the city. Even if zoning allowed towers and developers could afford earthquake engineering, federal law would still prevent construction in precisely the areas where market demand for density runs strongest. New York doesn't face significant seismic risk. Chicago doesn't have major airport flight paths cutting through its core. Los Angeles confronts both simultaneously, adding millions to construction costs while legally prohibiting height where it matters most. Los Angeles has few skyscrapers because of choices and constraints that accumulated over more than a century. The city rejected vertical urbanism from the start, embracing cars and horizontal sprawl instead. That preference became law through the 54-year height ban, forcing development to spread outward. When the ban ended, modern zoning locked in sprawl by reserving more than 3/4 of residential land exclusively for single-family housing. However, Los Angeles achieved something unprecedented. It became denser than New York without towers. The continuous carpet of medium-density development proved you could pack 7,000 people into every square mile through tight lots, small apartment buildings, and relentless horizontal expansion. Los Angeles' flat skyline emerged from deliberate planning, decades of regulation, and geography that made vertical growth far more difficult than spreading outward. The city chose sprawl, then spent a century ensuring nothing could challenge that choice.